You're watching the France 24 interview. I'm Mairead Dundas. Now imagine it's the year 2030 and the headline reads, "A world without tuberculosis, without malaria, without AIDS." It could be a reality if all countries meet the target adopted in New York under the Sustainable Development Goals. But getting there won't be easy, and it will rely heavily on people like my guest today, Mark Dybul, head of the Global Fund, which raises $4 billion per year to fight these diseases. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
$4 billion per year. How significant a chunk is this in the fight against these diseases?
A huge chunk, and countries like France are major contributors. In fact, France is the second largest contributor. We're the largest multilateral funder of HIV, tuberculosis, and malaria. So it makes a huge difference to the lives of individuals in countries all over the world.
Now, it's a funding institution. It began in 2002, and you've just released a report that looks at some of the results to date. I wanted to go through a couple of the major figures, those that stood out to me. A 43% decline in HIV-related deaths from a peak in 2004, 41% decline in tuberculosis death rates between 2000 and 2014, and in the same time frame, a 48% decline in malaria death rates. In total, 17 million lives saved. Do these figures give us reasons for optimism?
I hope so. 17 million lives saved is really extraordinary. As one member of a parliament said while they were voting to support financing for the Global Fund, we rarely get to stand up here and vote to save lives. And when taxpayers in this country and others support institutions like the Global Fund, they're literally saving lives. 17 million lives in a 12-year period. That's extraordinary. But the key is to get to what you said at the beginning. Saving lives is the first step. The second step is to end these epidemics. Malaria and tuberculosis have been around since a recorded medical history, literally thousands of years. This is the generation that can end those diseases. HIV is the modern plague, and that too can end in this generation. So it's extraordinary. The lives saved are huge, and it is individuals. Those 17 million, they're individual people with families, with livelihoods. And I've been to the villages where they are, and it's extraordinary to see the hope in their faces because they're alive and they can care for their families.
Now, obviously, we're hearing more and more of these, I might call them positive news stories around our efforts, but I can't help but wonder if sometimes it's a double-edged sword. The fact that they're working, that these efforts are working, does it also lessen the urgency to act in some ways?
It does, and thank you for covering positive news stories because we don't see many of those. There's a lot of positive things happening out there. But as you said, it also leads to people not paying as much attention. We tend to like negative news. But the positive news is extraordinary. I mean, we can end these diseases and we can lift people up and provide hope. And the reality is without tackling HIV, TB, and malaria, the chance of fighting, having economic growth, of fighting poverty, of taking care of the conditions that lead to chronic refugees, we can't do it. So if we don't invest in these things, we can't save lives, but we also can't save communities so that people can be productive economically and raise up their families where they live.
Now, one of your recent campaigns involves the rather beautiful actress Diane Kruger heading to South Africa to meet girls and young women with HIV. Now, it's not a new idea to use a celebrity ambassador as such, but after seeing global panics around topics such as Ebola, is it hard to shift the conversation back to what we might call the familiar diseases? We've been talking about AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria for a long time now.
We have, and the positive news plus the chronicity of the news makes it really hard, and that's why when people like Diane go out and remind people, it's hugely important. And those girls and women you just talked about are hugely important. Because of gender inequality, we see rates of HIV in young women and adolescent girls 8 times higher than the young boys. And that's all because of gender-based violence. It's because of abuse. It's because of gender inequality. So if we don't have a gender equal world where a young girl has economic opportunity, we can't fight HIV. Nor can we achieve any of the goals we have for society because a young woman, if she has money, will spend 92 cents of every euro to clothe, educate, and feed her child and provide health care. Sadly, if you give it to a man, we're closer to about 30 cents. So by empowering women, we actually will have better and more development. We'll also tackle the AIDS epidemic.
So a lot of your money does go obviously to empowering women. I wanted to just talk about some of the finances more specifically. Your number one donor is the United States. France is second, as you mentioned. There's also been significant contributions from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. With all this money, how do you decide where you're going to distribute the money? I mean, everyone equally, you'd imagine, is worthy of being helped.
We have two fundamental principles to fight these epidemics and bring them actually to their end while we're lifting up societies and creating the systems that will not only fight HIV, tuberculosis, and malaria, but will actually address issues like Ebola over time. So we have a mandate on these three diseases. So we focus on where the infections are. Where are most of the infections occurring in those three diseases? And what's the country's economic status? If you have a low ability to finance your own response, but you have a big burden, that's where we go. But we also focus on human rights issues. It's not just disease, it's actually the rates in what we call key affected populations, the most marginalized and vulnerable in society. In some societies, that's adolescent girls and young women. It's the LGBTI community, it's sex workers, it's prisoners, it's people who migrate for work, for example, minors. So we also try to focus resources to advance those key issues about human rights, because it's really, as we were talking about getting to the vulnerable and marginalized, whether you have HIV, TB, or you're just vulnerable and marginalized like an adolescent girl or young woman, and supporting that so we create a society, a welcoming, open society that will actually be a stable and economically growing society. So we focus on the poorest countries with the highest disease burden, but also where vulnerable people are.
You talk about human rights a lot now, and in the report, in fact, and I read that you're willing to cut support for programs that infringe on human rights. Can you give us an idea of what project might not receive your funding?
Well, that's actually that goes directly against human rights. You have to be really careful, because the vulnerable are in places with bad laws. That's why they're vulnerable, right? So we have to reach them, but you don't have to reach them necessarily through government. So you can reach them through civil society organizations that empower and lift up those poor and vulnerable people. But for example, if a program directly discriminates against a person, or a program directly violates the human rights of someone, then we will not fund them. But we can find other mechanisms to reach the same people. And so we're very careful about that, because you don't want to make a point and harm the person. So we find mechanisms to lift up that person.
I understand. Now, your reputation and that of your partners is indispensable when attracting finance. In 2011, this was before your time at the fund, several donor countries temporarily suspended their contributions because of a corruption scandal. Has it forced you to be tougher with the countries receiving the money? I'd seen recently that Nigeria has been warned that if some missing money doesn't turn up, they may not access all of their money.
You have to be tough. I mean, taxpayers have to know that the resources they're dedicating are going for the people in need and not to line people's pockets. And so we are very tough. We have zero tolerance for corruption. We pursue it, and we institute penalties when we find it, and we take action so that we don't find it again. Now, it's very difficult. These are challenging environments. There's a reason states are fragile, and they can be very difficult to operate in. But if you put the policies and practices in place, you do everything you can to identify it and weed it out. As you're doing that, you're actually building accountable governments for the long run. And so while part of it is absolutely punitive, and we have to be, part of it is actually long-term, what we would call development, to support accountability and transparency, and creating the systems and information systems so that people can not only follow flows of money, but follow the results you get for them.
We've seen during your time, speaking more largely about some of the drugs and treatments, we've seen serious advances since 2012 and over the last several decades. But earlier this year, you wrote, people who work in public health have become wary of dramatic headlines about medical breakthroughs. I just thought you might be able to explain what you meant by that a little more.
Well, it's been extraordinary, actually, over the last 10 years. 15 years ago, people were dying all over the place from these infections. And there's been so much advance in our science and understanding that we actually have treatment for HIV, for example, that brings it down to a level at which it doesn't cause harm, where we think people will live a normal life expectancy. Tuberculosis and malaria are completely curable, but we were seeing drug resistance to the drugs that were available. And so we needed new commodities to bring the infections down. Bed nets that protect someone from a mosquito bite now have insecticide in them, so not only do you keep the mosquito away, you kill the mosquito. It's extraordinary advance. But there have been such a rapid series of advances that people say, oh, there's another one. The other piece of that is scientific advance is extraordinary, but you actually have to use it and use it well. And so some of the healthcare workers were getting a little bit tired, and I used to be one before I became a bureaucrat, of here's another new thing when they hadn't implemented the last thing. So the key is to take that advance. And by the way, Pasteur Institute is having a great event, and Francois, one of your national heroes, celebrated 45 years there. France has led the way in a lot of the scientific advance, including in HIV and malaria especially. But we have to implement it. We actually have to get it to the people, and not just some of the people, the vulnerable people. And that's the trick. So I think what we are really trying to express is we need more advance, we need vaccines, we need better everything. But with what we have today, and this is extraordinary, with what we have today, we can end these epidemics. We can bring HIV to the point where it's no longer a threat to public health. We can end the epidemics of tuberculosis and malaria, and that will allow free flow of people across borders without carrying HIV or malaria and TB with them. We can end them as epidemics. So let's use the technology we have today, implement it, get it to the most vulnerable while we're developing the next generation that will not only deal with these infections, but hopefully will get rid of them, but allow us to tackle even more and more diseases. So we're trying to get a balance there. Let's use what we have today while we're looking for what we need tomorrow.
And to end these epidemics for good. We'll have to leave it there, but I'd like to end with a quote from Bill Gates, one of the donators, but in his words, he says, the Global Fund is one of the best and kindest things people have ever done for one another. So I think there's some encouraging words there. Thanks for joining us, Mark Dybul, here in the Paris studios. And thank you very much to the viewers for joining us on France 24. There'll be more news coming up.